This is a big one. We're going to discuss The Brothers Karamazov by Fyodor Dostoyevsky. This is arguably considered one of the greatest novels ever written. It's right up there with Anna Karenina. What's different about the way Dostoyevsky writes, even though both books were in serialization, is that Dostoyevsky is going much deeper on subjects. For example, this whole book, even from the cover, this is a portrait of him, like recreated portrait from an early photograph. And you see there's a Jesus reference on the cross. That's indicative of this novel because it deals a lot with religion, as well as psychology, which is a trope of Fyodor Dostoevsky. So this book has illustrations, and I splurged for this. I'm not that familiar with this illustrator, but I just wanted like a nice edition for myself because it's like when I read this book, years ago, I felt it was like a big accomplishment, and I believe around the same time, or maybe right after, I read Anna Karenina. So I was like trying to tackle these like big epics. Here's what the book's about. Basically, there's the father, Fyodor, and he's basically an asshole. He has one son, Dmitri, from a first marriage, and this son was in the army for 8 years, and he's very much like the father. He's like wild, a cynic in terms of religion. And then from a second marriage, he has Ivan, who's like an intellectual, but he's kind of on the fence of religion. He's agnostic, I would say, closest to agnostic. But the way Dostoevsky writes them, he's conflicted, but he's on the fence. And then the third child and the youngest, Alexei, he's a monk. He's like 18, 19, and he's in the monastery, and he's trying to be very, very pious. And so there's the three main sons. The youngest is closest to the father, and in fact, one of the things to note is that eventually both Dmitri and the father, the youngest son and the father, fall for Grushenka, who's like this kind of very attractive, I wouldn't say she's a courtesan, but she's not the purest of heart, but she's a very attractive kind of seductress. And she's got benefactors, and they both try to win her over with money. And the youngest son, Dmitri, he's trying to cash out on his inheritance, and the father gave him most of the inheritance, and a part of it, he gave him as a debt. It's a bit convoluted, but he's trying to get more money from the father to elope with Grushenka. Funny enough, Dmitri, the youngest, is also engaged to Katerina, and he's trying to elope with Grushenka. So there's these love triangles because Katerina is perhaps a better suit for Ivan. There's some chemistry there, and by the end of the novel, they're kind of quasi together, but Ivan is in a bit of a sickly state by then. partially influenced by the events that take place. And anyway, so the first wife was a little bit nutty, and she kind of went crazy. And then so there's the three brothers. And this is important. The reason I mention is like the different types and the way, like how deep they are into religion and how much they believe is very significant, I believe, to Dostoyevsky, because I feel like his greatest strength, although his writing is very solid, his greatest strength is structure, the overall structure, and the ideas presented. I feel like that's the greatest strength that he has as a writer, because it's very verbose at times. The writing is contradictory, and I feel like because he was a gambler and he was always like in need of money, and the book was serialized. It gives the feeling sometimes, as I begin to become more of an experienced reader and a writer myself, that he's just, he's upping the word count in a lot of cases. And then it's towards the end of his life for Dostoyevsky. It's his last novel, and he died, like, I believe, a couple of months after. So his greatest strength is like the characters he presents and like the issues that he tackles psychologically and religious philosophies that he questions, maybe for himself. So he's always like trying to tackle something for himself, which I always prize as an author. So there's one other brother. There's a fourth brother that is illegitimate and unacknowledged. His name is Smerdakov, and basically the father raped this like kind of lunatic homeless woman years ago, and he had this illegitimate, like, she birthed this child and nobody really knew whose it was, but I believe maybe she claimed that it was Fyodor, but he denied it. And she birthed this child, and Fyodor, who has like some property and wealth, he has a couple of serfs, and this the child is left on on his doorstep, and then the serfs take him in because they were childless. Grigory and I forget his wife's name. They take the boy in and they raise them as his own, and he helps around the house and so forth. So he's like a serf to Fyodor. And the boy hears like the stories about, maybe he's like the son of Fyodor. That comes to bite everybody in the butt later. So it ends up being that like the son, he's like the most, the Smerdakov, the illegitimate son, is like the most conniving and perhaps like the most intelligent in the sense of being shrewd. Because what ends up happening in the end is he kills the father, and Dmitri gets blamed, and then there's like a big and he kills the father, and then he commits suicide. So then like everybody's screwed because there's no proof. Like without him like being forced to at least testify and maybe being caught in like a lie, there's no proof that anybody else might have committed the murder. And then certainly Dmitri, because he was in contest for Grushenka with the father, had all the reasons, and then he even like wrote a confession, maybe under like pressure, So there was like a lot of incriminating evidence against him, and there's complexities. Like for example, like even Ivan at one point before the murder takes place, he leaves out of town, and Smerdakov kind of winks at him and says like, yeah, good idea, good thing you're leaving just in time. And Ivan's like, I don't know what you mean by that. And then Smerdakov tries to guilt trip Ivan into believing that basically Ivan gave Smerdyakov authority to kill the father because he hated Ivan hated the father. So Smerdyakov is saying basically, before he kills himself, he's saying that basically I was fulfilling your evil desires, and therefore you're complicit in this murder. And that actually puts Ivan over the top in terms of like he goes kind of, well, I wouldn't say nutty, but like he has a breakdown, and he's pretty useless when he has to go to trial and to be a witness and speak, because he's really torn, and he thinks like he is complicit by ill wishing. And then that's kind of like a religious aspect to the questions that Dostoyevsky poses throughout the novel. So there's the psychological aspect of the brothers, and what they represent. And I remember reading it, and I felt like it's kind of predictable that like the illegitimate son is the one that would commit the murder, because he would have the most emotional problems, and there was like elements of madness because of his like homeless, like nutty mother. And it's funny because like the wildest character, Dmitri, his mom kind of went nutty as well from the first marriage with Fyodor. So, it's interesting that Dostoyevsky is conscious of psychology before the time that really psychology existed, before Freud, before Jung. Dostoyevsky was tackling these topics, and it's no surprise that Dostoyevsky is considered the grandfather of psychology. There's that aspect which is really deep. And then I bookmarked this section here, the Grand Inquisitor, and this is a fascinating chapter. It's the most famous chapter in all of literature. And Ivan, the middle son, who's a bit of an intellectual, is having a discussion with Ilyosha, the youngest brother. And Ivan says like he has this poem, which is like, he calls it a poem, but it's kind of like a parable in a way. And in it, it's a parable, it's a dream, In it, like, it's the Inquisition, and Jesus comes back, and the Grand Inquisitor actually he jails Jesus, and he has a philosophical debate with Jesus, and the debate has to do with several things. Like, one is, what's the best thing for society in terms of like what should people follow, whether it should be law or the church. And then, because the Inquisition is basically where the church acts as, law and judge and executioner. And this debate continues too, with like the monks at the monastery and Ilyosha in other discussions. The consensus is that people are better controlled through the guilt that they would feel from breaking commandments, in essence, rather than like just being told by the law that you're not allowed to do something. People are controlled by guilt more. But then another big thing, and perhaps even bigger in this conversation, is the topic of freedom. Whether people are actually free. And what the Inquisitor argues is that people don't want to be free. They want to be told what to do. And they want to be controlled. And they're essentially relinquishing their freedom so they can sin. Because if they submit to like a higher being and they admit that if they give away their freedom, and then they can just repent, they can sin and repent, and they don't have to live to a higher standard. Because I think the idea is like to have freedom, there's more responsibility. So they're relinquishing freedom to live in sin. And that's one of the big conversations here. So in the end, the monk plans to kill Jesus, but in the end, he lets him go. He says, just beat it, just go, and never show your face again here, because we got this. So that's like it's like a very famous chapter, and there's like kind of a lot going on in that discussion. And I read it, like I said, years ago. I remember covering it again in a philosophy class in university, and I reread it for this review. And it's so dense that really, like, maybe in a future review, I should go like line by line and highlight everything and like really go topic to topic, because that's like the best way to handle this, because there's so much in this chapter. So Alyosha has like this monk. There's like a lot of extra characters, like it's a big cast, and he's got this monk Zosima. He's a mentor, and he eventually passes away, but he tells like Alyosha, you're a little too young, but you should go out in the world and like find your own way. And what was interesting about like even the monks, they have like their variant philosophies, so it's not like they all like are in consensus about one way to see religion in the world. They have like their own unique ways. And to some extent, I feel like sometimes that's like Dostoyevsky's way of just checking all the angles of a viewpoint. So he does a fantastic job to like cover so many aspects, like this kind of cubist discussion of religion, mostly in this book. It's like very much about religion, but the way the characters act and what they represent leads us into psychology, especially like the murder, and it's got this big drama, and it's a lot of action. It's like quite good, and at the end, it ends like in this big courtroom drama, where Dmitri is up on trial for murder, for parricide, and everybody from across the country is coming to this case, and it's a big deal. And just about everybody that's left takes the stand, and he's found guilty, which it's not that much of a spoiler because it's such an old book. And he's found guilty, and he's sentenced to like 20 years or so in jail. And there's a lot of little like nuances, like for example, it's funny because he ends up going to like working in the gold mines in jail. And then one character earlier suggests that, like, hey, he's like trying to gather up money to take Grushenka away. And then one other character is like, no, forget about the money, as a joke. It's kind of like Dostoyevsky's humor. It's like, forget about the money. What you need to do is like just go off on your own and like work in the mines, the gold mines. And it's kind of, there's little ironies like that Dostoyevsky plays with, because that's exactly where he ends up being. Like fate brings him there. So he's in jail. Ivan is recuperating at the end. Ilyusha, is a little distraught, and all together with Grushenka and Katerina, the four of them, Grushenka, Katerina, Ivan, and Ilyusha, are plotting to plan an escape for Mitya, for Dmitry, to get out of jail, and their plan is for him and Grushenka to run off to America and eventually come back, but under like a different name and start a new life. So it's, apparently Dostoevsky had a plan for sequel. So it ends up like a courtroom drama, like he's in jail and a planned escape, and I mean it's all action by the end. It's quite an amazing book, and it has everything. Beautiful illustrations, which I'm not talking about so far. The artist Fritz Eichenberg did a wonderful job of illustrating this epic book. And I believe these are like works on like tin or something. It's are fascinating. I'd be curious about the process for those artworks. Yeah, they're really like impressionable pieces, and they got kind of a Kafka-esque feeling to it. I mean, that is the period, Anyway, phenomenal book. There's a lot to consider. It's very complex. There is quite a bit of humor as well throughout, and certainly a lot of tragedies. Other characters die. There's a young kid that dies at the end of tuberculosis, and there are a lot of great scenes in this book. It's a fantastic book with so many layers. It's huge. I mean, the page count is like, this is actually 2 rows of text, so it's at 600 pages almost, with 2 rows of text on a big book. So imagine, a paperback. I remember the old paperback that was like a Bantam book that I had years ago, came to like 900, almost 1,000 pages. So big book. And then in the end, I just want to say, like, so Alyosha is kind of like the protagonist of the story. He's like the youngest son, the youngest Karamazov, and he's kind of like, he represents hope. Each character very likely represented an aspect of Dostoevsky's own personal doubts and questions regarding religion, and in the end, his youthful character was the one that was like the most clear-headed, the most like optimistic, and the kid with tuberculosis passes, and there's this kind of like very brave kid named Kolya, and the other kids in the neighborhood, and they get together. They're kind of sad after the passing, and Alyosha cheers them up, and he says something, and may the dead boy's memory live forever, Alyosha added again with feeling. Forever, the boys chimed in again. Karamazov, cried Kolya, can it be true what's taught us in religion, that we shall all rise again from the dead and shall live and see each other again, all, Ilusha too. It's like Ilusha is like the young boy that passed. Certainly, we shall all rise again. Certainly we shall see each other and shall tell each other with joy and gladness all that has happened. So it's an optimistic ending, and everybody says hurrah for Karamazov, the last remaining kind of solid Karamazov that's not a criminal, that's like a kind of an upstanding citizen, a religious, pious person, pure of heart. He remains, and he's trying to right things that were wronged. It's a very fitting ending. The structure is there, and I think like the best way to look at Dostoyevsky when you read him is to look beneath the text, the ideas that are right underneath the text, and the beautiful structure on certainly this book. It seems long-winded at times, and it does take a while for the crime to take place. The crime takes place like in the second half of the book, so he's like building characters and having debates, and then the crime takes place, and then the courtroom drama. I mean, certainly that could have been longer because it was really, really exciting when it happened. It's a grand work of literature. The Grand Inquisitor chapter, definitely the most important and maybe influential chapter in literature, and just a masterpiece, debatably the greatest novel ever written, Brothers Karamazov. So I'd love to know what you thought. I'm sure you have deeper insights. There's so much to cover that I feel like when I was reading it, I was noticing all these debates, and so many topics were brought up that it's near impossible to cover in a 20-minute video. So I think when you read a book like this, it's you just want to absorb the ideas and the questions, and carry them with yourself, and occasionally debate with somebody else to flesh them out, and maybe by questioning, it'll give you a clearer idea of what your beliefs are. If one character's perspective doesn't resonate with you, then you know that you're on the other side of that spectrum. So it's really interesting, and I'm curious which characters you guys identified with. Enjoy.